In his novel, The Old Man and the Sea, Ernest Hemingway writes, "Now is no time to think of what you do not have. Think of what you can do with what there is." For me, that line has become a reminder that if I were to spend my time solely thinking about the obstacles that I have to face and how overwhelming they are, rather than thinking about how I can overcome them, I would be sinking into a ruthless, swirling sea against which I stood no chance. Unfortunately, over the course of the pandemic, so many of us were thrown headfirst into wild storms of emotion and feelings, the likes of which many of us had never faced before, and the effects were significant. In findings from the survey on COVID-19 and mental health, published on September 27, 2021, 1 in 4 Canadians aged 18 and older screened positive for symptoms of depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder. A series of 9 surveys was conducted by the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health and reported that 25.1% of survey participants felt moderate to severe anxiety, 24.1% of survey participants felt loneliness, and 22.3% felt depression. But if we're looking at this deeper, beyond the numbers, what has this looked like in a more personal sense? I cannot speak to everyone's individual experience, but I can speak to mine. So, this is the story of how I realized that I was drowning and how I learned to swim. In March of 2020, I had just truly started to connect with a group of friends at university, and I was finally feeling like I was finding my place. I had no way of knowing that after seeing this group together in person one time, I wouldn't see many of them again at all for months, and I wouldn't see us all together again for the better part of a year. I had no way of knowing that after developing a special bond with my best friend, I wouldn't be able to hug her for over a year. When it suddenly became impossible to live my social life in the way that I had grown so accustomed to, it felt like what was once a lifeline to me was suddenly no more than a rope fraying by the second. Isolation is a word that we are all too familiar with in the physical, medical, and emotional sense. Lucky as I was to be at home living with my parents and my brother, the sense of isolation that I still felt was like being hit with a wave of ice-cold water. It was shocking, it was uncomfortable, and it was something that left me with a chill. The physical isolation was required for the greater good and for the sake of safety, but that did not make it any less difficult to face. It was so foreign to be so removed from my friends, my extended family, my environment. The emotional isolation was, and is, a much more menacing foe. I felt myself pull away from relationships, no longer having the energy to give the way that I once had. And it was when I felt myself take these steps back and remove myself from these essential relationships that I stopped and I searched for reason as to why I was suddenly unable to keep on keeping on. And then the discovery was made. I had spent so much of my life jumping from one thing to the next with so little time for self-reflection that I don't think I ever truly understood how lost I was until suddenly it was just me. Alone in my room, I was forced into an in-depth dive into the chaos of my mind and the roiling, turbulent storm of every suppressed thought I had. It was like I was a ship, and I had been developing a web of cracks over time, until suddenly the pandemic came along, and like an iceberg, with a single strike, those fissures shattered. And I was overcome by a rush of every feeling and emotion that I had ever refused to acknowledge. And I was drowning. My relationships became strained. I was in such a volatile state with my emotions that I would react and snap and lash out at people over the smallest things. And I'm ashamed to admit this was most often directed at my parents, as living in such close proximity meant that they were frequently on the front lines with me. To put it in the simplest terms possible, I was not a nice person to be around. I pulled myself back further from relationships. I barely had enough energy to keep my own head above the water. So who was I to devote time and spend time with these people in relationships that barely felt real anymore? Picking up my phone felt like a chore, and I dreaded making plans for video calls because I knew I would have to put on this performance and pretend I was as cheerful as ever. And as it became harder and harder to push that mask of happiness into place, I simply didn't. I didn't want to put in the effort anymore, and so I removed myself entirely. And even though I knew this wasn't the way that I needed to handle my emotional exhaustion, it was the easiest path, and it was one that I was all too relieved to take for even the briefest respite from my fatigue. Prior to the pandemic, back in October of 2018, I was diagnosed with ADHD. I had, for a long time, struggled with completing my work in the same time frame as others, along with copious other issues that fell in line with the symptoms of ADHD. While I pride myself on the work that I've done towards managing and accepting my ADHD, I experienced massive setbacks throughout the course of the pandemic, particularly thanks to online learning. When I was physically in classes and lectures, the environment helped me to focus. But when I was at home, where anything and everything could become a distraction, it felt like I didn't stand a chance. Focusing on my work was this insurmountable task, and I could feel my stress grow exponentially as I felt myself slip out of control. Likely, in some relation to this, I more recently received a secondary diagnosis: depression. This diagnosis was a long time coming. I could feel there was something wrong, particularly when I noticed that activities and pastimes I loved no longer brought me joy. They no longer brought me any sort of feeling whatsoever. Receiving a diagnosis is enough of a challenge in and of itself, because you are forced to look at yourself and admit that what is going on is more than just a bad day, a bad week, a bad month, a bad year. As I began to work on my management and my treatment of this new battle to face, personally, I struggled wickedly with adding a new medication to my routine and the general stigma that surrounds being medicated. I found it impossible at times to work past feeling like simply I am not strong enough to handle the stress of my own life. I have come to realize now that there is a beauty in knowing when it is time to let go of the wheel and ask someone else to steer the ship for a while. Knowing your limits is not admitting a weakness. It is showing a strength in your self-awareness. In the strangest sense, this was an experience that was so necessary for me. Had I not been forced to look inside at the chaos of my mind and this crazy, riotous storm that was brewing deep inside of me, I would have continued to live this half of a life, never truly acknowledging my entire self. It is solely through facing this storm head-on that I feel like I'm seeing a break in the clouds. The winds have died down, the waters have calmed, and the slightest rays of sun have started to creep through, illuminating those once eerily dark waves. And it is in that glimmering reflection of the waves that I am realizing this truth, that my mental health, no matter how challenging and murky and difficult it is, does not have to be a burden. It is not a sentence to a life of struggle. It is something that will be made of both pain and beauty. But is that not life itself? After what felt like swallowing mouthful after mouthful of distasteful water, it finally felt like I was kicking my legs back towards the surface. I opened myself up. I joined support groups, online forums, I met new people, and I spoke more openly about the struggles that I was facing, realizing I was not alone. And it shocked me how freeing it was to open my arms to my mental health and to welcome it no matter how damaged it was. Learning to accept every beautiful flaw that I was facing felt like I was one step closer every time to ending the battle with myself. I began to put effort back into my relationships, but in a way that served me better this time, no longer forcing myself to feel or pretend to feel a certain way, and I welcomed my most authentic self. I focused on people who filled me up and who fixed the cracks in my ship's hull, and I noticed a significant improvement in these focused relationships in my life. To my parents, to my friends, to my family, to the people that I've met along this journey. To those who did not give up, to those who held on, thank you. I have been fortunate enough to return back to campus with my cohort and receive a warm welcome back to an amazing educational environment. And I've rediscovered my love and my passion for my program and university. Most truly and significantly of all, I feel like I have honestly found myself. I've learned through recognition and acknowledgement of myself, I've learned through all of these things that I've had on this crazy journey over the last few years, that it is solely through pushing these emotions and feelings down that I have allowed weight after weight to be chained to my ankle and pull me further and further below the surface, but no longer. Now is no time to think of what you do not have. Think of what you can do with what there is. For me, that line will serve as this reminder, that if you look at what is in front of you and you do not open yourself to the possibility for positive outcome, and you only focus on the challenge, you are setting yourself up for failure before you have even begun. You must know that within you and around you are the sources for strength that you will need to face the battles that lay ahead. I want to make it abundantly clear that by no means am I at the end of my journey. If anything, I am at the very beginning. There will always be shadows to face. That is a harsh but undeniable truth. But rather than focus only on that darkness, let your eyes focus just a little bit longer. And I assure you, no matter how faint it is, they will find that light. Thank you.